Okay, now I want to discuss basic moving and capturing. I just covered how to cover the various chess pieces, and now let's put them on the board and explain some more rules about actually moving the pieces. So in my first video, I talked about how to move the rook, bishop, and queen. So let's start with those pieces and discuss them in general. So let's talk about this rook here. So in my video, when I had no pieces on the board, I discussed that the rook can move something like this. Now, if the board was cleared of pieces, the rook could move any one of these squares that's sort of contained on this line. But unfortunately, there's some other chess rules. And the first one is that, well, except for the knight, a piece cannot jump over another piece. And number two, two pieces cannot occupy the same square. And just maybe a subset of that rule is that you can't move your piece to another square already occupied by one of your pieces. And if you move your piece to a square occupied by an opponent's piece, you get to capture that piece. So let's just look at the rook. So the rook would start here, and then it would move like in this direction over this line, okay, or it would start here and move up. But let's go over that rule again. So let's start by moving horizontally now. It'd start here and move this way. Now obviously it can't move to this square here because it's already occupied by the knight. And if I try to keep going further to this square, I just said you can't jump over another piece. So realistically, the rook cannot move in this direction at all. Because one, it can't move to the square occupied by the knight, and then number two, it can't jump over another piece. Now let's move the rook this way. So yes, we can move here because the square is unoccupied and I haven't jumped over a piece. I could also move to this square because it's unoccupied and I haven't jumped over a piece. Same with this square. Same with this square. Same with this square. The only thing that changes when I get to here. Now, this square is occupied by another piece, but it is an opponent's piece. So if I decide to move here, I would actually place my rook here and remove the pawn, and I've effectively captured the pawn. But what about this square? Now the rook cannot move to this square because I would have jumped over the pawn to get to the rook, and that's not allowed. So this rook can start to move, can move to any one of these squares here. If it moves to this square, it captures the pawn. That means I'd put my rook here and remove the pawn from the board, but I cannot move here. Okay, hopefully this makes sense. Here, let's pick another piece. Let's move to a bishop. Let's look at this bishop here. So in my original video, I would draw something, a bunch of arrows like this for this bishop, saying it can move to any one of these squares. But remember, at that point the board was unoccupied, so there was no problem. It could move to any one of these squares. But now let's look at the new rules about you can't jump over pieces, you can't move to the square occupied by one of your pieces, things like that. So let's start with this direction here for the bishop. Well, it can move here because it's unoccupied and I haven't jumped over a piece. And I can move here because it's unoccupied and I haven't jumped over a piece. So the bishop could actually move to any one of these two squares. Now let's go this direction. Well, the bishop can't move here because one of my pieces is already here. A white piece is already here, so I can't move here. And the bishop can't move here because one, it's occupied by a white piece, and two, I've jumped over the pawn. Now let's go this direction. So I can move the bishop here because it's unoccupied. I haven't jumped over a piece. But I cannot move it here because the white queen is already here. So I can't move the bishop there. Now let's look in this direction. Well, I can move the bishop here because it's unoccupied and haven't jumped over a piece. Same thing here, unoccupied, haven't jumped over a piece. Same thing here, unoccupied, haven't jumped over a piece. Then once again I get to here, Now I can move the bishop here, and now an opponent's piece is here. If I were to move the bishop here, I would place the bishop here, and I would remove the pawn from the board, and effectively the bishop would have captured that pawn. How about this square here? Well, I can't move the bishop here because I would have jumped over this pawn right here. So the bishop cannot come over here and put this and move to this square here, which would actually be, if I tried to, would be capturing the rook. So that's for the bishop. Hopefully you're starting to see the pattern now. So let's try the white queen. So it would look something like, all the possible moves would look something like this for the queen if we were to draw it from the original lesson. So let's just take all these in turn. So the white queen can't move here because it's already occupied by piece, and I can't move any one of these two squares because I would have jumped over this bishop. How about here, this direction? Well, I can't move to this square because it's already occupied the pawn, and I can't move to these two squares because I would have jumped over this pawn here. How about this direction? Well, I can't move here because it's already occupied by the pawn, and I can't move to any one of these squares because I would have jumped over this pawn right here. So I can't move in this direction. What about this direction? Well, I can move here because it's unoccupied, and I haven't jumped over a piece. Now I can't move here because it's occupied by the bishop. I can't move to these two squares because I'm jumping over the bishop. What about this direction? I can't move here because it's already occupied by the king, and then I can't move to these two squares because I'm jumping over the king, and can't move to this one because I'm jumping over the king and it's occupied. So realistically, the only move the queen has is moving to this square. After all is said and done, after everything is drawn, the only move the queen could actually move is here. So, well, let's move to, hopefully you see the pattern now. And the only piece I want to talk about now is the knight. The knight is special because it actually is the only piece that can really jump over another piece. Because as I explained in the video, the knight sort of moves directly to that square. So let's just move if I draw arrows for this knight right here, these are all possible squares this knight can move to. So let's just take them one by one. Well, it can move. Now, there's no jumping over another piece for the knight, so it really just matters if the square is occupied or not. So the knight can move here because it's unoccupied. It can move here because it's unoccupied. It can move here because it's unoccupied. It can move here because it's unoccupied. If the knight chooses to move here, we'd actually capture this bishop, meaning we'd place the knight here and remove the black bishop from the board. And then same thing here. The knight can move to here, and if it did move here, we'd place the white knight here and take away the black rook from the board. So maybe let's just do sort of some very basic moving and capturing with this knight. So let's say the knight did decide to move. Let's say decided to capture this bishop here. So it can move here. So we'd actually move. Now my chess program will do this all automatically, but I move here and watch this black bishop will disappear. See, now I've moved. Whoops. Should switch off my chess engine, but that was the next move I was going to make. So as you noticed, the knight moved to that square and the bishop was removed from the board. And now we know that this king can move one square in any direction, and it can actually move to the square where the knight is, and if the king moves in that direction, then it would move to this square because it isn't jumping over a piece. It only moves one square in each direction anyway, so And when it moves here, we remove the king here and remove the knight, so that's capturing the knight. So that was an example of the knight moving and capturing the bishop, and then an example of the king moving and capturing the knight. Well, that is basic moving and capturing.